Good morning and welcome to a cold winter day on the 1st of November. I had a little technical difficulties last night. I was going to do this when it wasn't so windy, but I wanted you to see how beautiful the fall is. What a transition though, overnight for us about 30 degrees from October 31st to November 1st. I want to talk to you about something this morning, and I'm going to just share from Galatians chapter 3 in Eugene Peterson's, and I'm going to paraphrase his message, which should be really interesting. The purpose of the law, he said, was to keep a sinful people in the way of salvation until Christ, the descendant, came, inheriting the promises and distributing them to us, and Ephesians talks about that. But obviously this law was not a first-hand encounter with God. It was arranged by angelic messengers through a middleman, Moses. But if there's a middleman that was at Sinai, then the people are not dealing directly with God, are they? But the original promise, the Abrahamic, is the direct blessing of God, received by faith. So Peterson says, if such is the case, is the law then an anti-promise, a negation of God's will for us? And not at all. Its purpose was to make obvious to everyone who we are in ourselves, and we're out of right relationship with God. It's to show us the futility of devising some religious system for getting things on our own effort, or how do you get a relationship on your own effort with the God of the universe, the power to create, who had power to create life in us. Well, we certainly would have gotten it by this time if we were mature enough to respond freely in faith to the living God, and we were carefully surrounded and protected by that Mosaic law until then. And the law was like those Greek tutors. They show you the familiar escort to school, protect them from danger and distraction, making sure that the children really get to the place they set out for. But now you've arrived at your destination, Peterson writes, as a translation of verse 25. By faith in Christ, you're in direct relationship with God. Your baptism in Christ was not just washing you up for a fresh start. It also involved dressing you in an adult faith wardrobe. I like that. The wardrobe is Christ's life. Now, Wolfhart Pannenberg, a Lutheran professor of systematic theology at a German university, wrote a couple of very interesting articles. He passed away about 5 or 6 years ago, but he was a big name when I was a seminary student. And he wrote a couple articles that are very eye-opening, and this is basically what he said. He said up to the 15th or 16th century, it was just understood that you couldn't have a cohesive society. You couldn't have a cohesive culture unless everybody agreed on what the religion was and what the law of God was. It was ridiculous to even think you could have a society with many different religions. Everybody has to agree on what is right. Otherwise, how in the world are you going to make a decision? How will the judges make decisions? How will laws be passed and written? How will we live? Now, I believe that the 10 sayings and the other follow-up terms of relationship that we call the 10 commandments were actually marriage vows between God and his bride. And I'll get into that a little bit deeper later, but I want you to realize that this is more than just societal rules that have to be agreed on. They're relationship rules that have to be agreed on. Whether it's how to live in a marital relationship or a societal relationship, like the United States of America. I'm going to turn away from the wind, sorry. Back to Pannenberg, who says what happened is essentially what most of the world's actually rejected. That idea that you couldn't have a cohesive society, you couldn't have a cohesive culture unless everybody agreed on the religion and what the religion was and what the law of God was. And he said the reason was, he thinks, and I think he's right, that you can say, oh yeah, the various philosophers, yeah, okay, he's probably smart in saying this or that or the other thing. And yes, it's true that philosophers came along and said, hey, we can't believe there's a God. We can't believe there's a law. We can't believe these things now. Well, he says what really happened was, and it started in about the 14th century, but especially in the 15th and 16th and even the 17th century, that what we had in Europe, what were called the wars of religion. People got up and said, God is on my side, and they began slaughtering each other. And of course, that has always happened. But it really got pretty bad, of course. Now I'm being very general because, frankly, I'm not much of a European historian, as you can tell. But the wars of religion were terrible. They decimated people. People got their religion and said, we're right, and therefore the rest of you are trash. It would be good for the world to wipe you out. So your understanding of God, your understanding of religion is terrible. It's so bad, and they went out and slaughtered because of that. Now, Pannenberg says that when the dust cleared, a lot of the smartest people began saying, now wait a minute. This whole approach doesn't work for society. This idea that there's an absolute law of God that we all have to, well, people take the law of God and they say, because God is on our side, we can destroy everybody else. It took hundreds of years, and of course, many of the philosophers thinking they were just reading and thinking and coming to these beautiful ideas on their own because they're great minds. And in many ways, Pannenberg says, they were responding to the horrible specter of war. They began to adjust. And many people who claim to be Christians in particular, but not just Christians, other religions too, and not just one kind of Christian, not just Protestants or Catholics, but everybody was in on it. And Pannenberg says that the specter of people saying they were Christians with the Bible in their hands as they slaughtered them, doing these things in the name of God, Pannenberg says that we decided, in a sense, to move away. And what has happened today is things have completely moved in the opposite direction. So that the reigning idea, listen to this, in the West, is that you can't have a cohesive society if you do believe in an absolute law of God. The idea is the only way you're going to have people taking care of each other and loving each other is if we decide all truth is relative and that everybody has to decide what's right or wrong for them. And that everybody needs to be accepted and embraced and loved, and no matter what, no judgment should be made, whatever. Pannenberg says, now the problem that's happening is that we're not yet anywhere near the crisis. But he says we're probably moving toward a crisis situation, because guess what? Do we not begin to realize it's possible that that doesn't work either, this relativism? I'm not sure everybody's going to agree with this. As a matter of fact, I'm sure everybody won't agree with it. And we may be many, many years away before people do on the whole. But there's a man who didn't believe in God, who was a very brilliant law professor, a man named Arthur Leff, who wrote a fascinating article in the Yale Law Journal many years ago. He graduated from Harvard, but this was for Yale. And it basically, he said, it's really intricate, very involved, very classic, but as far as I know, most modern secular people stay away from this. I'm not sure they even have any idea what's in it. It's kind of like, don't touch that. You know what? He says, if there's no God in the universe, there's no law of God. There's absolutely no way for us to ever know what is a just law. Very interesting. He says, back when I was a kid, I was on the playground. If somebody would make an assertion, he says, this is wrong. One kid would always say that another kid that you come up to you and say, well, says who? Because let's face it, Leff says all authority is in the mind of the sayer, so to speak. Sorry, I had to get out of the cold. It's really cold. But he says up until the 15th or 16th century, everybody knew if a law was there. The reason the law was there, it was just God's law. And if a law was unjust, it wasn't God's law. He says that very simply. 300 years ago or so, people started deciding we can't have a society like that based on the laws of God. Who knows what the law of God is? And it creates oppression and so forth and so on. And we're basically going to figure out right or wrong on our own. Or let's make a God out of science. Have you heard that lately? Let's make science the driving force for everything. Well, he says, breaking it down, now he wrote this in 1979, and he was an atheist. So at the very, very end of his article, he says something like, the so-called death of God was not just his funeral, but it totally eliminated any coherent ethical or legal system. And by the way, this is an atheist talking. He says neither reason, nor love, nor terror can make us good. And worse than that, There's no reason why anything should. And as it stands now, everything's up for grabs. Everybody listening to me would say napalming babies is bad. Starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling people is depraved. Okay, Left said. Says who? Now, if you haven't read the article, and I certainly am not going to take time to go through it, you may not feel much of the force of that. What he's really trying to say is, how dare you impose your cultural values on me by saying slavery is wrong? Says who? Who says that these things that you're saying are wrong, like slavery is wrong, or mistreating somebody because of their race is wrong? If everything is relative, why is that wrong? He says, you're laughing, but you're not reasoning. Give me a reason, Left said. You can laugh, but that's not on the argument. I've given you an argument, Left said. I've said you have no basis for moral outrage. You have no basis for saying, this is how it has to be. You can start to say, well, it's practical or it's pragmatic, or, well, practical or pragmatic for who? Says who? In the end, let's face it, the idea that there's an absolute moral law and that God is going to judge you unless you do it basically didn't work for society. That's what Left's saying. Now, I'm saying, and I hope eventually other people will say it too, Left went on to say, that, and I may not be alive to see it, that this consensus that when you say everybody does what's right in their own eyes, there's no right and wrong and everything's relative, that's not going to work either. I want you to know that 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, the people who knew the God of the Bible already know that. They already know if you try to say that law is the dog and love is just the tail that's being wagged, or that love is the dog and law is just the tail, you're going to have a disaster. If you say basically it's the law, yes, God is loving, but only up to a point. You'd better do good. That's making law absolute and love is just the tail being wagged by the dog. On the other hand, you could say God really is love. You can say, yes, there's a right and a wrong, but when it comes right down to it, basically, everybody has to do what's right in their own eyes. That's love with law wagging the tail. Years ago, thousands of years ago, the God of the Bible said, neither of these is more primary than the other. They're absolutely equally foundational. And you say, where does it say that? Well, let's go back to where one of the primal passages in Exodus. It's after the giving of the law on Sinai. And God says, don't you ever, ever, ever choose between these two things. Those two things have to be equal, love and the vows. Those two things have to come together. They have to be meshed and reconciled. And you never must say it's one way or the other. Never. You say, where do you see that? Well, I said it, Exodus. Again, still at Sinai, but after Exodus 20, after the giving of the 10 and the following statements, Abraham says, show me your glory. And God says, I'll show you all my goodness. And he puts Moses in the cleft of the rock. And it says in Exodus 34 that God passed by and proclaimed his name. Moses is asking for God's glory. He says, I'll show you all my goodness. These things are the same. First of all, show me your glory. Now, that's a typical thing for us to say. Show me your stuff, what you're made of, your essence. That's what glory is. Give me the thing. Give me the ultimate ousios in Greek, what your essence is. It's a very general question. Show me what is the ultimate. And God says, I'll tell you what the ultimate is. The ultimate is I'll show you all my goodness and tell you who I am. So he put him in the cleft of the rock, and it says God passed in front of Moses, and in this is what he said. The Lord, the compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he will by no means clear the guilty. He punishes the children and their children for sins of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. And that was his glory. I don't want you to overlook this. Obviously, I'm not going to let you. This is one of the most important and complex passages in all the world of literature. God comes and says, I'm going to show you all my goodness. Then he says something that seems absolutely and fundamentally contradictory. And of course, Paul is true to it in Galatians. And this is the reason why guys like Wilson say this is irrational. First of all, God says, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Then he says, but I will by no means clear the guilty. Now what's going on? He says, I'm a forgiving God. I love you. I have compassion over you. My heart just aches for you. And I absolutely will never clear the guilty. Basically says, I'm a forgiving God who will never forgive. Unless. Now what does that clearly mean? Every sin has to be punished. I won't clear it. It's got to be paid for. You know why it's important? To the degree that you understand those two things held together, I personally think that all of our minds, we have a tendency, because we're human beings and because it's only by revelation from heaven that you can understand a God of both love and a God of justice, a God of both vows and promise and holiness and compassion. They're not separated. They're not bifurcated. By temperament, by personality, by background, by culture, but I don't know what. We all go one way or the other. And God says, you'll not really see my glory. You're not really going to sense the greatness of who I am until you see these two things are absolutely, utterly together. A guy named Horatius Bonar, what a great name, a Scottish preacher in the 19th century wrote, law and love must be reconciled. The one cannot give way to the other. Both must stand, else the pillars of the universe will be shaken. And God comes in and says, don't you ever say one of these is the real one and the other is sort of apparent. That one of these is the basest one and the other one is just sort of hanging on there. Another way to put it is this. He says, I will make all of my goodness pass before you, all of it. One of the things we have to see here is what he's saying by all. If a person is just, you absolutely do what is right, no matter what, no matter how you feel, no matter what the situation is, you do the right thing. That's an expression of goodness, right? A certain kind of goodness. Good people are consistent. Good people are fair and just. And on the other hand, if you forgive, if you say, oh, let it go, I love you, no sweat, let bygones be bygones, that's an expression of goodness too. But look, God is saying, I'm a forgiving God, but I can't just forgive everything unless something deals with it. You say, well, you can't have it both ways, God. Either you're good in the sense of being just, in which case you're not going to be able to forgive people, or you're a forgiving God, in which case you're not going to punish everybody. You can be good one way or you can be good the other way, but you can't be all good. Yet God made all his goodness pass before Moses. And until you see that, you haven't seen who God is. Paul says in the gospel, and only in the gospel, the good news, do those things come together. Only in the gospel do these things come together intellectually and theologically. Only in the gospel do these things come together in history. Only in the gospel do these things come actually together in your heart and your life. And I guess, but it's never really happened, it would be the only way that they would come together in a society. Well, let me just say something rather quickly. I'm going to be pretty quick about all four of these things because, like I said, I'm trying to give you the big picture. And I'm not sure that you and I, with all the looking at the trees, are standing back and seeing the forest. Here's what Paul means. First of all, you say, well, how in the world could that come together? This is the reason that Wilson says that it's contradictory, irrational. This is the reason why you can read other religions and they're not contradictory. They're not contradictory because they don't try to combine these things, love and law. You go to Islam, they'll say Allah is merciful, but really only up to a point, and that is justice. You go to Buddhism and they'll say, well, you do have to live a good life, but basically the law is an illusion. It's only up to a point. No other religion even tries. Nobody else tries. Nobody. But God says, until you see the two pillars, those two things, are absolutely fundamental, you don't know my glory. Paul says, until you understand the gospel, and only in the gospel, can those things be brought together. Now let's look at it theologically and historically and practically real quick. Honest. The reason it has to be quick is because that's the only alternative. The other alternative is to get like an encyclopedic view of this thing, which we don't have time for, and you don't have the patience for. First, law and the love of God come together theologically because of the substitutionary atonement of Christ. Now, I'm just going to read you a couple of quick quotes. Other religions, other than Christianity, don't have a substitute or a mediator. Paul says in Galatians 3:13 that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, he says, God made him sin who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. 1 Peter 3:18, for Christ died for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. That's a great one. And of course, we've got Mark chapter 10, verse 45. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Now let me read you a great quote just to explain this. This is a paraphrase again of Horatius Bonar. By Christ's substitution, and especially at the moment of his death on the cross, and only at that moment, God's love and law are both satisfied. On the cross and only on the cross, the love and the standards of God perfectly and brilliantly coincide and shine forth together. Jesus was smitten to satisfy the justice and the stroke paid for our sin. It was also to satisfy the love of God, since that stroke secured our salvation. Now this is quoting Romans 3:26, that God might be both just and justifier of those who believe. Isn't that great? God might be both just and the justifier. You see, Paul says that that's the genius, the substitutionary atonement. Well, let me just finish up. To paraphrase Bonar again in his book, The Everlasting Righteousness, both love and law on the cross have triumphed. The one has not given way to the other. Each has kept its ground. No, each has come from the conflict, honored and glorified. Never has there been love like this love of God, so large, so lofty, so intense, so self-sacrificing. Yet never has a law been so pure, so broad, so glorious, so inexorable. There has been no compromise. Law and love have both had their full scope. Not one jot or tittle has been surrendered to the full. It's all in its severity and in its tenderness. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan goes on to the stone table. Well, we never can say, just try your best. Pharisees always say, I've done my best. I've tried my best. I'm just asking for my rights. That's not taking the law seriously. Your best doesn't satisfy the law. Law has never been more truly law than when he died, because that was God's way of saying, I would even go to these lengths. I would even let mutability come into the heart of the triune God's immutability. I would let death come into the heart of the ever-living one. I would let finitude come into the heart of the infinite. I would do this to honor the law of God. That's how important it is. You don't say, oops, the law. No, but love has never been more truly love. On the cross, that's the whole book of Galatians is all about. Jesus didn't just die to give us forgiveness. On the cross, Jesus was our substitute. That means we are as free from the condemnation of the law as if we had died and gone to hell and paid our time. Jesus did it for us. You don't say, well, I'm just trying my best, and lately I've just been goofing up, and I wonder if God will accept me. Well, then you don't understand the gospel. Therefore, Romans 8, there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Either Jesus paid for the sin you just did last Tuesday. Let that sink in. The sin you did last Tuesday, either Jesus Christ paid for it or you're going to pay for it. Why? Because God is all good. It's going to be paid for. And if you don't accept Jesus paying for it, you pay for it. It means if you've said, Lord God, forgive my sins for Jesus' sake, that means God cannot be punishing you for the sin you did on Tuesday, or God would be getting 2 payments. Even you and I wouldn't do that. We're not the greatest paragons of virtue in the universe, but we don't demand 2 payments for the same bill. And never has love been more truly love. Never has a law been more truly law than at the moment Jesus Christ died. It comes together theologically. Now, intellectually, we got it. I mean, there it is. It's there. Wilson, who said it was irrational, can look and say, it can't be. This is ridiculous. Well, all right. The problem is they have their grid. They either have a law grid or they have a love grid. They read Paul, this what goes on all the time. Or they come to United First Church and they look around. And the fact of the matter is that you and I are going to drop everything off of the gospel that doesn't fit your grid. Human beings have a grid. And today, the time changed for many of us because the days are getting shorter in this hemisphere. And some of us, unfortunate ones, have to go to daylight savings time or off of it anyway. For example, for many years, you looked at the stars and you saw a body passing by. And you saw the sun going this way. And a few months later, you see it at a different trajectory. And when your grid was that the sun went around the earth, you interpreted the sun as slipping south. But when you started to say, wait a minute, the grid is that the earth goes around the sun, then you read the same data differently through the grid. And you said, oh, it's turning into winter. In other words, the same data is interpreted differently depending on the grid. If you come and say this religion is either a religion of law or a religion of love, you can't keep them together. It's impossible. You're coming through your grid. The gospel says both truth and love. It produces both holiness and graciousness. It produces both moral conviction and the absolute melt-in-your-mouth sweetness toward other people, whether they believe it or not. You see this? But that doesn't fit in the grid. How could that happen? How could it possibly be that you could have this incredible moral conviction and not go to war and beat everybody else up who doesn't agree with you? Only if you believe you're not saved by obeying the law. On the other hand, you're not a person who says, well, doesn't matter. I'm saved by Jesus' obedience to the law. The law is absolutely critical. It's very important. I no longer have to obey in order to be saved. I obey it in order to please the one who saved me. And that changes utterly everything. Your attitude toward yourself, the vows, the 10 sayings toward God, toward people who aren't listening to it, that creates the thing that frankly creates a human being the societies of this world desperately need. If you fill the world with people who don't believe there's any law, society falls apart. Right now, it's living off the capital of tradition. On the other hand, if you fill the world, and we've done this, with people who are sure that you're saved through obeying the law, society is going to fall apart too. People don't believe there's any other grid. It's one or the other. Before I say this, I want you to understand that when I use the word righteous when speaking about people, I'm thinking of the Greek word dikaiosune. Covenant relationship is the basis of my relationship with God. And when they read Galatians, or when they look at you, if you're a Christian and you understand the gospel, people are going to say, well, you're really a this, or you're really a that, when you're really not. You're neither. The legalist says, you're either righteous or you're a sinner. The Christian says, I'm a righteous sinner. When I become a Christian, I'm no longer a sinner who's not righteous, or a righteous person who's not a sinner. I never really was that. I'm now a righteous sinner. Some are going to say, oh, I'm not a sinner anymore. I'm not talking about your identity. I'm talking about your practice. You notice that? I told you it'd be fast, but do you see how it works together theologically on the cross? Do you see how it begins to work together in history and your life? You also see how eventually it would work together in society. Now let me close on this one. What would actually happen then? How will Christians save society? I don't know. I really don't know. And here's the reason why. I probably shouldn't be putting this on video. This is going to sound a little pessimistic. The fact of the matter is that for brief periods of time, when the church recovers the gospel, the church always is split into fundamentalists and liberals. It's always been. You might think that's modern, but no. When the Great Awakening rose up, the Great Revival, Jonathan Edwards was one of the great preachers, and he recovered the gospel. And what is the gospel? That it's not love or law, but it's love fulfilling the law. And then it's the law being fulfilled by love. He started to preach it, and of course, what was done? Well, he was smacked from one side by the people who were really very rational and very legal and very ethical and didn't like all this talk about being born again. He was smashed from the liberals. On the other hand, people on the other side began to get very, very, I don't know how you put it. On the other side, basically, men rose up and began to preach and began to nominate people. They began to preach very, very emotionally. And that's all right. There's nothing wrong with emotion. But they began to become very authoritarian and very cultic and very domineering. And it still happens today. Very often, when you actually get back to understanding how through the cross all the goodness of God is passed before you and passes into you, a person who really understands, who has moral convictions, but then has the incredibly sweet and humble approach toward the people around, is the best possible citizen. If you multiply citizens like that, the only way the world will begin to understand us is probably not with what we say. When you preach the gospel, people are going to hear it one way or the other, depending on their grid. The legalists are going to come and hear the gospel being preached and say, you're not talking to people enough about what's wrong with their lives. You're doing too much felt needs stuff. And on the other hand, if you preach the gospel, people will come from the other side and say, what you really basically are is a moralistic fundamentalist, and you're just not very judgmental. In other words, they'll work you into their grid. People will not, therefore, listen probably so much to what you say. People will watch what you do. And when it comes right down to it, unless you're able to mix the truth and love in your life, unless you're able to just bust through all the categories and destroy the stereotypes, break through all their grids by your character, by the way you live, it's not happening. We need to fill the world with servant leaders, hearts on fire with the gospel, just like Jesus Christ, full of grace and truth. Truth without grace isn't really truth, and grace without truth isn't really grace. But Jesus Christ came full of grace and truth, and he can fill you with the same. Now, I've made my share of horrific mistakes in my life, and it scares me to think of having or being an example for people and people watching my life in that way. On the other hand, it's a tremendous opportunity, because although we have been sinners saved by grace and my identity is no longer as a sinner, it doesn't mean I don't fail. I just try not to fail as much. I try to submit, try to